Hi, it's Stephen Seiler here. On the 18th of July, I'm really looking forward to presenting my 3-hour live stream hosted by the Physical Performance Show, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. Get your tickets today, and I will see you online.
We are thrilled to be hosting acclaimed sports scientist Dr. Stephen Seiler, forefather of polarized training, on an upcoming 3-hour live stream event in July. Dr. Seiler, during this live stream, will cover 4 key areas around sustainable training for attainable endurance goals: intensity distribution for long-term performance development, interval training, periodization and peaking, training monitoring to support the process, and Q&A time. To register for this live stream, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler, and from just $49, you can learn from one of the world's most preeminent sports scientists around all things endurance training. The ticketed price includes post-live stream recording, a workbook, and of course, live Q&A time with Dr. Seiler himself.
Hi guys, this is Stephen Seiler. It's nice to be back on the Physical Performance Show. A lot has happened in the last months for all of us all over the world, so we're going to talk about COVID-19 and considerations for how it impacts our training. We're also going to talk about hitting the wall in the marathon and some training considerations around those longer races. So I think it's going to be fun. Join us.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by our upcoming live stream event with this week's expert edition guest, none other than Dr. Stephen Seiler. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of POGO Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest inspiration and information designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes: expert editions, interest editions, featured performers, and coaches' corners. And today, we welcome back the most downloaded guest of the show to date, Dr. Stephen Seiler. We featured Dr. Seiler way back on episode 172, where Dr. Seiler discussed in detail the findings from 20 years of his research in the field of exercise physiology around the polarized training effect. That is, how endurance athletes can seek to perform at their physical best through the combination of 80% steady aerobic work and 20% high-intensity training. If you missed episode 172, it is a must-listen-to episode, as mentioned, the most downloaded to date in the history of the show. And we felt it timely, through these challenging times that we are all navigating, to once more catch up with Dr. Seiler to glean his wisdom around how athletes and endurance athletes should best navigate the COVID pandemic. And on this episode, as you heard Dr. Seiler reference at the start of the show, Dr. Seiler will share his top 3 tips for navigating the COVID era with regards to training principles. We explore the impact of life's stressors, including COVID pandemic stress, upon an athlete's well-being and their training. We discuss the importance of the coach-athlete interaction, the importance of maintaining chronobiological rhythms on a day-to-day basis. We wrestle to the ground the long-held debate of whether 2 sessions in a day are better than 1 long extended aerobic session. And then we specifically explore all things marathon pacing. Hitting the wall, what is it and does it happen to every endurance athlete? How to select your pace, and what Dr. Seiler has discovered from looking at the training metrics of the top marathon performers on the planet. All this and more in this week's expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. Get ready with a pen and paper. Here is my conversation with Dr. Stephen Seiler, acclaimed exercise physiologist, forefather of the polarized training approach, and now viral TED speaker. Dr. Stephen Seiler, episode 172, featured guest expert edition. To date, the most downloaded episode of the Physical Performance Show across 4 years. Welcome back.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here again in this digital universe that we work in. Almost 1 year ago, by the time this goes live, that we will be pretty much exactly a year that we last recorded and focused in on your much of your scientific work to date. But you've been one busy scientist since then, Stephen. A TED Talk, late 2019, how normal people can train like the world's best endurance athletes. Maybe that's a good place to start. That's had nearly 500,000 views on TEDx on YouTube. Yeah, actually, it's available on 2 different locations. And they seem to be independent. So maybe it's 1 million, as far as I can tell. So because it was first local and then it got lifted up to the TED site. But anyway, yeah, that was a big deal for me. A TED Talk is kind of a crossway or a mark of excellence or something. I don't know. It's just something. It was definitely a bucket list thing for me, because I have such respect for the TED Talk format and all the great people who have given lectures there and so forth. So it was extremely nerve-wracking, very different situation for me. I usually can give lectures to audiences and not have a 3-beat increase in heart rate, and just love it. But man, when I walked out on that stage, my heart rate was 120 beats a minute, and so I had to really get inside myself and deal with the nerves of this kind of live performance where every word counted and you didn't get a do-over. That was a good experience. I thought that was part of the act. I thought that was all built in. You got up there and you did say, as you checked your watch, 120 beats per minute. This is high. I thought that was just warming up the audience. Well, actually it was. For me, it was a coping mechanism, because in the dress rehearsal the day before, I blew it. I sucked. Here I am, this guy that's used to speaking, and I had to do a do-over after 20 seconds into my dress rehearsal, and so I thought, my goodness, you're just going to make a fiasco out of this whole thing. So then I had to come up with a strategy for myself to help me kind of get grounded and get, connected to the audience and relax a little bit. And so I decided to make a little bit of a joke on the way out. So I actually had to, right before, I had to tell the technical people, I said, start the sound system as I'm walking out, or before, because normally they wouldn't start it until you get to the, your red dot. So I literally gave them some instructions right at the last minute. I said, hey, just trust me, turn this on a little early, So anyway, it all worked out, but boy, I tell you, it's a nerve-wracking deal. It's prime time, and it's a great experience. And then, this was pre-COVID-19, and it was just the start for me of like what was supposed to be almost a world tour. I went from there to Northern Ireland, to Oxford in the UK. I went to, where else was I? I was in Italy. I was in Brazil. And I would have been with you in Australia. I would have been in New Zealand, US, France, well, it all got shut down. So like a lot of the athletes that we talk to and the training we talk about, we all, have experienced just this, unexpected, complete change in all of our plans in the last months. And I think that's been a big challenge for lots of people. I'm lucky, I've been able to keep working, but but in a very different way.
You know, you've been outputting some great YouTube videos on your channel lately, which is a fantastic channel to subscribe to, Dr. Stephen Seiler, easily found, as is the TED Talk. Just on the TED Talk, before we do speak about some of the practical considerations around training in the world that we currently find ourselves in, you started that by saying no pain, no gain. It's described as a modern American mini narrative, but when it comes to training, it's just wrong, destructively wrong. Now, those that follow your work will know exactly where you're coming from, but I'm curious, you must have had a lot of positive feedback off the back of that, where people started to question, do they need to be, you know, smashed into the red zone, as you put it, every time they ever put their joggers on?
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. I don't know if it's because of the TED Talk, but I definitely have gotten a lot of feedback from people who have written things like, hey, you saved my career, or I accidentally discovered this polarized training and now I'm actually enjoying exercising again. So that has really been, you know, gratifying. It's sad because it tells us a little bit about the situation that we easily get pulled into, which is we all love training. I mean, that's what you start, is you think this is fun. I want to get better, and it's rewarding. And then for very many people, it becomes a drag, you know, because they feel they train a bit too hard too often, and they kind of get into this chronic state of fatigue, but they don't know how to get out of it other than to double down. If you know what I'm saying, there's a tendency that the prescription that is causing the problem, you just do more of, because you can't imagine a different strategy.
Push harder.
Yeah, you push harder because, you know, well, I can't get my heart rate up, and what's wrong with me? I just need to suck it up and go harder. So there's this, you know, you get into this negative spiral. So that's what's been interesting to me, is to hear people say, hey, you know, you gave me a license in a way to do something that I just didn't think was allowed, and that was to ease up, to go easier on some of these days, and you know, smell the flowers along the way. And now I'm racing faster, you know, and they're surprised by it.
And the surprise being that, you know, it does in many ways defy common sense, where, not common sense, but common belief, where harder should be better, and more of it should be better as well. And you so eloquently stated it back on episode 172, avoiding that intensity black hole, the middle zone, where you're too tired to truly make it count as a hard, intense session, and you're too impatient to go steady, and we keep chasing squirrels. So probably a good little recap of some of your work on episode 172.
Yeah, and the chasing squirrels part is something that I got from another, you know, someone else, which I just loved. I think it was somebody that tweeted. He said he was referring to something I'd written. He says, yeah, you know, I always start out with those good intentions. And he was referring to Zwift, you know, being on this massive online cycling platform. And he says, I start out with great intentions, and then all of a sudden I see, you know, a sign sprint or a segment, or someone cycles past me, and there I go, chasing squirrels, you know. And for me, it was a great metaphor, because I'm kind of a country boy, and I understood, you know, the idea of the dog that just cannot help but chase the squirrel, which it will not catch. It will not achieve the goal ever, you know? And so it's futile. And unfortunately, the human brain, particularly the male human brain, I would almost argue, is easily pulled into that in the training atmosphere.
Oh, for sure. And no more so than on bikes, I've observed and witnessed over the years. And, you know, you also state, you know, be disciplined, know what the goal or the target is for the day, and stick to it. And one of those famous Stephen Seiler adages, know the plan and then work the plan. And, you know, that certainly still applies to what has been this big shift most of the regions of the world to indoor training, right?
Definitely. And there's been, I'm glad to see that some countries, some areas, including my own, are coming out of this, but many are still in the middle of it. And so there is at least still a tendency for there to be a much bigger proportion of our total training is being performed indoors. For some athletes, like swimmers, they're not able to swim still. So the modality of training is also getting shifted towards what is available most indoors at home, and that is tending to be cycling. So there's been a big increase in the amount of cycling time relative to the total distribution for both multi-sport athletes, but also for athletes that would normally be swimmers or runners that have just been prevented from doing that. So that's been interesting. And I got some hard data on this way back in March, and that was the clear trend, was that cycling was the preferred modality. It was available. And so then you're getting on these platforms that are by their very nature kind of conducive to competition. They're great. You have group rides. I don't know if you're familiar with these. I don't want to single out Zwift, but it is kind of the dominant platform. There are others. And the Zwift platform, which is really catering to the pros, to the best athletes and that. And so it's fun. You get to ride. I've ridden with Cadell Evans and other big stars, when I say with, I mean, I was in the game at the same time they were, So,
that's a width, Stephen.
That's a width in my book. I'm taking it. So, but it is so easy to just, to swing above your average. You get so drawn into this stuff, and that's fine sometimes. But if it's happening every day, then it will have consequences. It'll drag you down,
There was a lot of Twitter activity going from the Dr. Stephen Seiler account in requesting data. And one of the sets you grabbed between the 26th of March and the 3rd of April, you had 1,078 responses. And that is where, as you just said, that there was this adoption from other athletes, swimmers even, towards cycling, and more cycling from triathletes, for example, and lots of other things there that put cycling at the fore. But one of the things I have heard you comment on, Stephen, is that no athlete should be dragging themselves out of the basement at the moment, or through COVID at the peak of some of the stress.
Yeah, I'm not. I have to think about what the context of that was. But I guess the issue that we were dealing with in March and April was that you have a lot of athletes that have, including my daughter, the only athlete I actually coach day to day, that had laid down these very clear plans. They had these milestone competitions that provide both motivation and structure in their whole year plan. And then all of a sudden they're gone, just woof, gone, up in smoke. And so then the athletes went through a period of just total confusion. What do I do now? And then a period of mourning, I would almost say, all this hard work and now for nothing. And then maybe the third phase was kind of just okay, let's make lemonade out of lemons here. What's what can I do? How can I make the most of this unexpected and for most people, a very negative situation? And that's where, at least for a lot of athletes, maybe the answer was, I think, to not necessarily follow through the same degree of peaking, the same degree of, where you're really kind of sharpening and doing some of those really high intensity sessions towards a very specific race, because those races weren't there, and the cost of that peaking process on the body and on the brain is pretty high. And so being able to get yourself into a different mentality where you say, well, no, I can put in a new block of, let's call it gap closure, where I'm trying to look at my weaknesses as an athlete and use the opportunity provided by this unexpected season, change to improve certain weaknesses. That was something that I suggested, and I think probably others did too in this period. But the thing was to give yourself a break. And for at least a lot of athletes, we're still there. There's still, like my daughter, there still is no clear likely competition for her until September. She's done some virtual races where, she's actually set a PR for 10K on the track solo, and then she just had to submit her time as one of 6,000, with the files, to the verification and everything. That's all we've got right now. So it's hard to be really motivated in that scenario. And my daughter's just representative of thousands and thousands of athletes. So I think we're still, for at least a lot in this phase, where it's kind of like in a cycling race where you don't want to burn your matches too early. As athletes, that's also true in training. If we know that the big race that we were peaking for is pushed 3 months later than it usually is, or whatever, then we've got to have that racing mentality to say, okay, hold back. Don't start your sprint too soon, because you'll leave it on the track. You'll leave your best fitness on the track if you do that, or in the 3 miles before the finish. So it's kind of that same situation that a lot of athletes are in from the periodization process, from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you say, the uncertainty, dates for world major marathons and cycling tours, Ironman triathlon events have all been pushed out, but even so, they still remain speculative. And the periodization process is almost impossible when you don't know what the end date is for trying to arrive there, right? It's as you say, so don't burn your matches too early. Just look to turn the opportunity, to make it an opportunity to rather focus on weaknesses. Can you list any specific focuses that athletes might have in the endurance world to work on during this time, Stephen?
Well, that's when I guess the physiologist in me kicks in, and I think about time frames for adaptation, and what takes the longest to achieve, what kinds of adaptations are more, I've used the term fresh fruit, meaning that they happen pretty quickly and they also disappear pretty quickly. And the basic way to think about it is those long-term, sustainable, aerobic adaptations, building mitochondria, developing efficiency, and all that. Those are the kinds of things you can do all the time. That never goes away, that need. And for at least for the long distance, the triathletes, that is the bread and butter. That is what you're born to do. If you're a great triathlete, is just these long, sustained workouts. So it's tougher. The question is more about these types of really high intensity sessions and what they add. And they do add fitness, but they add the fitness improvement they add is modest if you're already doing quite a bit of volume. Typically, what we've seen with high intensity interval intervention studies, the improvement is somewhere around 3%, 3 to 4%. Well, that's very meaningful, but it's just important that we don't lose sight of the 90%. And the 90% is the basic work you do every day, those long runs, those long rides, just getting that volume in. That is, you can always go, you can always count on that to be useful.
And as you said back on episode 172, hard sessions don't make champions, but doing the daily grind of ordinary workouts does.
Yeah, and of course it is a grind sometimes, but that's what I think. That's where we have to be good to ourselves, and the coach has to, think about the situation we're in, make sure that we're finding enjoyment. That usually athletes enjoy running or cycling just because that's how they are. But we got to just make sure we get the quotient of enjoyment to grind is acceptable. So my point is that in the periodization plan, know your body. For example, if I use my daughter again, we have learned, and she is grudgingly figuring out, that she doesn't need more than about 4 to 5 weeks of an interval progression before she is really benefiting from it. The effects come fast. But if she keeps going, then she flattens out, then she stagnates. So once you start to understand the time frames that you need for different kinds of, like you say, well, I'm a middle distance. I'm going to be doing some sprints. I need a big, strong finish. I need to be able to sprint at the finish of this 5K. I need some anaerobic power. Well, that's something that you can improve in 4 weeks, with very specific workouts over a short time frame. You certainly don't need to be doing it in May for an October race. So these are the kinds of things we need to think about is how long does it take to achieve it? Let's not burn matches when it's not necessary.
As you say, that's that fresh fruit analogy.
Yeah.
Happens and disappears quickly.
It does, and it happens at a significant cost. It's a stress, those tough interval sessions are stressful on the body. And you are managing, as an athlete or as a coach, we're managing our total stress tolerance. So, for example, this is a discussion I just had with my daughter. I said, look, I want your big gap that we need to fill, the weakness you have is power and speed. In other words, speed reserve. She's a 34, 55, 10K, 116 half marathon, not bad, but she's got no speed. So she can't run probably faster than 32 for 200 meters. I say, now we've got a chance to get better at that because down the road you need it. But, my dear daughter, you've got to take something for somewhere else. You've got to reduce the duration of your longest runs. We've got to provide energy for your body to do the strength training, to do the power work that you need to do to improve that deficiency. Does that make sense? So you got to redistribute your energy when you're on the edge of what you can tolerate. It's a zero-sum game.
Yeah, it's that managing the total stress. So if you're going to increase it with filling the gap in for your daughter with her speed enhancement there, then you need to pull it off that long run, as you say, because it's managing the total workload on the body. And it makes me think as a sports-based physiotherapist, Stephen, around what I often term the invisible, unmeasurable forces such as psychological stressors related to study, financial pressures, relational pressures, in this case, COVID-19 and all the uncertainty and stress that is largely playing into for athletes' lives, which, it must be a consideration in managing their total stress, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think you hit on something extremely important. This COVID-19 has been probably as much as anything a mental stressor for people for lots of reasons. It's a stress on students that have part-time jobs, that suddenly those part-time jobs are gone. It's a stress on people because you lose social interactions. There's lots of psychology here. Again, my daughter typifies that. She's a college student. She's working on her senior thesis, and my goodness, it affected her training. When she's trying to hand in her final senior thesis, and she's competitive in that too, just like so many people. Now we're over on this. The typical female student athlete is going to be world class in everything at the same time. In their head, they don't give themselves a break anywhere. And so that you put yourself in a spiral of just total stress meltdown. So I've seen it as a coach. I've seen it as a father. And of course, you can talk to and look at the literature. And for the body and the brain, stress, as you know, is kind of an omnibus response. the brain and body they're not easily able to distinguish the stress of a coming exam, the stress of unpaid bills, or the stress of a high intensity interval session. They all three have some common pathways that they trigger in the human body. And so you're right. So that means that stress is cumulative. And if you're in a situation as an athlete, as a student athlete, as an age grouper with job pressure, it's futile to fight this and think that you're going to find reserves and somehow, you're going to double down and both work twice as hard in the classroom or in the digital space to try to keep up, plus you're going to keep training, plus you're going to do, that's not realistic because this is accumulative. So I guess that's been one of the messages that I would try to convey is let's accept the situation for what it is. If your work situation or your school situation is really tough on you right now, then accept that maybe that means you need to back off a bit on the hardest training sessions. Give yourself a little bit of room. Add a rest day. That's what with my daughter. If we would say, she said, "Papa, I've got this big assignment due," and I said, "Okay, let's have a rest day so that you have a day where you forget about running and just focus on writing." Or So I think we really have to balance those things, and I guess if I were to talk about the coach-athlete relationship at that point, then I would say that's where you really need communication. The athlete has to trust the coach to communicate and to accept the things that they're saying and not just think about the training side. And then it goes both ways. The coach has to trust the athlete to really communicate all the issues and not just the training issues, because it's really easy, especially for the guys. They will tend to just say, "Yeah, I'm fine." You do not want to show weakness. And instead of saying, "Hey, coach, that last interval session, I was on the ragged edge. I think I'm a little bit overstressed. I'm a little bit overreaching right now. I need to back down." Well, I, as a coach, I know my athlete, and I know that they typically are full guns. They are ready to go to war every workout. Well, if they're saying they're tired, then I gotta trust that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is, I think, we're in this situation. That's always important, but it is particularly important when you're in a situation where the whole life stress pattern is being disrupted.
And hard to, in many instances, quantify those invisible realms. I mean, as an exercise physiologist, obviously there's some variables that can be monitored and measured, heart rate variability perhaps, different, you mentioned in the prior episode when athletes get stuck in the middle, their responsiveness, substrate utilization, things shift and change. But to the everyday recreational athlete, not in a lab or subject to leading sports science, I think we could all reflect and remember times where we felt tired and we pushed harder and we didn't consider the pressures we were under. So there's no easy way here, is there? It really brings into the art and science of coaching.
Yeah, and I am, like you say, I'm a physiologist. I love the laboratory. I love data, I'm the one, the geek that wants to see the data from my daughter's workouts, and she's the one that doodles in her little analog diary and has no interest in the numbers, And both of those approaches have value. And heart rate variability can be a tool. You can measure blood hormones. There's so many things you can do, but research has shown, and as far as I know, it is still valid today, that the proverbial canary in the coal mine, that if you remember the old days of the canary would reveal an oxygen deficiency down in the coal mines because they would keel over first. So they would have these little birds down in the coal mine. Well, the canary in the coal mine, that first indicator that things are going bad, is just your brain just how you feel.
Yeah.
It's just your sense of the state of humor. How are you? You know, I made fun of this many years ago when I used to work with speed skaters because I called it the hair and the yogurt test. You know, around the breakfast table, some of the guys had longer hair, and if they were kind of leaning forward and their hair was falling towards their yogurt, they're not smiling, they're not telling jokes. Well, that was an indicator that they're tired, and that will show up much faster than the clear 5-day rolling average of heart rate variability, or, you know, some cortisol increase that you would measure in blood hormones that nobody's actually doing. So the point is we all have this basic tool, which is just how you feeling, what's your outlook, how are you waking up ready to go? And if you are, then that's a good sign. If you are not, then that's also an important sign.
And yet the dogma of the day, or it's fading. It is, you know, people are becoming more aware of, you know, no pain, no gain being a misleading concept. But the dogma of the day is, you know, if you're tired, what's wrong with you? Come on, push harder. You know, you need to summons more from you rather than respect what those signals are saying. It makes me think, Stephen, of prior Coach's Corner guest, current coach of the coach of the current World Triathlon Series champions, Katie Zafiris and Vincent Lewis, Joel Filiol, who mentioned that as a coach, one of the great things that he feels helps with his role is being around his athletes regularly, because he can monitor their non-verbals. How were they at the breakfast table that morning? How were they just in a conversational chat? All these seemingly intangibles.
That's right. And I guess that's one of the reasons, well, there are a number of them, but I get asked quite often if I could do some coaching, you know, from a distance. And I generally, or I always just have to say, well, number one, I don't have time for that kind of interaction. But number two, and most importantly, I don't think that's a good way to coach. It's very difficult to be a good coach without ever looking your athlete in the eyes and getting a read on them. And having that trust-based relationship where you can communicate face-to-face. I know you can get a lot done digitally, and boy, I'm working at it myself. There is still value to that face-to-face communication. It doesn't have to happen every day, but you do. It is such a value to actually understand, like you say, the nonverbals and see how they react to your questions and all these things.
Stephen, before we shift off some of maybe we summarise it, what are Dr. Stephen Seiler's top 3 COVID training tips? Top 3 tips.
Well, trust the basics, I guess, would be one, is that, look, most of your fitness is coming from just doing the basic work and not any magical training sessions. So that would be the first issue. Number 2, I think, would be, well, you're really putting me on the spot here. I would definitely say don't burn your matches too early, meaning if you've got a big disruption and your big races have pushed far, you know, down the road, then don't be afraid to take away some of those workouts that would have normally been part of a peaking process, and delay that and wait until you actually, you know, because again, there is a fresh fruit component to all this. So we don't want to leave your best fitness, you know, on the trainer in May at home when the race is now not until September. And I guess the third one would be give yourself a break, in the sense that, hey, training probably is not the only thing in your life that's being disrupted right now. If you're a student, if you're a self-employed, or just lots of situations. So probably your stress load, you may be teaching your small kids at home, or there's just a lot of different sources of stress. Give yourself a break, and don't expect to be on fire on the bike or on the running path every day, because you're dealing with a lot of other stuff, and that's okay. So those would be my three.
Very powerful. Trust the basics. Don't burn the matches too early and give yourself a break. I have heard you share around the importance of still, whilst we're without competition, where we can, trying to maintain the rhythm of our training. You know, if we were to swim in the morning, duplicate that, and you labelled it a very exercise physiology term, but the chronobiological rhythm. Can you just speak to that concept and why that's important?
Well, it is, our bodies do fairly quickly entrain on, that's another, we kind of connect to some rhythm, the flow of the day. And so, for example, if you normally get up at 6 a.m. and go for a swim, you've got an early morning swim at the gym or at the pool, and then you have a late afternoon ride, you're doing doubles, or whatever that rhythm that you normally have is. Obviously, in the COVID-19, when it was shut down, it'd be very easy for all of that rhythm to be completely disrupted. So my recommendation to people was, even if you have to pretty dramatically change the training volume or the modality, so you couldn't swim, well, go ahead and still get up at 6 and do 30 minutes on the bike, on the trainer, or 30 minutes of strength training or just to keep that rhythm of how, your brain is used to getting up, to, turning on a bit of adrenaline and going out and doing something. Well, let's keep that going, because then when a state of kind of semi-normality returns, it's going to be much easier to plug back in.
Yeah.
That was one issue that I think a lot of people would have been facing, is just that basic rhythm. The structure of their day was completely disrupted. And for many, the structure of their day is still different. I know I was telling someone last night, I said, look, I forget when the weekends, and the weekdays, when they, what's what, because I'm sitting here always doing the same stuff, working from home. My brain is just totally confused, so everything's melting together. So it is difficult. It is difficult to kind of keep some structure in your day and in your training rhythm.
And from that data set, the findings that you had were that the longer rides were getting shorter. I've heard you comment that obviously if you're cycling and outdoors, there's the freewheeling time. And you found quite a significant, what was the percentage of drop you found from some of those longer rides when you looked at the 1,000+ respondents that came through from their COVID-19 training habits when they shifted indoors?
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, they were doing a pretty good job of keeping up the total volume, but obviously you've got, on the tail of the distribution, you've got some of these hardcore people that would typically have been doing 4 and 5 and 6 hour rides. We had some pros and so forth in that sample, and they were typically cutting back. They were dropping down from, say, maybe they would have done a 6 hour ride as a long ride during the week. Now it was down to 4 or 3.5 or something, So they were still doing decent volume, but they were just dropping some of the really, mind-numbingly long workouts doing them indoors. And that brings up another issue, which is, at least in cycling, this issue of the one long session versus 2 shorter sessions. Because at least in a lot of endurance sports, it's very common to do twice daily training. Elite runners, very typically cross-country skiers, rowers, they all basically, if they're at a reasonably high level, they migrate into a 2 daily session, 2 daily training rhythm. Whereas the cyclists at the highest levels have tended to stay in a 1 session rhythm, but often longer. They may stop for lunch during the 6 hour ride, but you're kind of treating the ride as 1 session, 1 workout. Well, I think some of this has been a bit challenged in recent years just by the success of other endurance athletes doing it a different way, by the availability of really good indoor training facilities, or, these indoor options, and trial and error and so forth. But we are seeing at least more tendency that really good professional cyclists are saying, you know what? Yeah, there are periods where I can have good effect of doing 2.5 hour rides separated by a 4 or 5 hour recovery. Actually, we did a study. I organized during this, the worst of this COVID. I said, well, let's make some lemonade out of lemons here. And I know I've got a captive audience, so I kind of used digital tools to organize a comparative study where I was able to recruit 47 athletes, triathletes and cyclists, to do a 4 hour ride indoors on one day. And then we collected their power, their heart rate, their perceived exertion. They weighed themselves pre-post and so forth. And then on another day, usually with about a week of room in between, they did two 2-hour sessions at exactly the same power, exactly the same intensity, but they did a morning 2-hour ride, 6-hour recovery, and an evening or afternoon 2-hour ride. And they measured the same variables and so forth. Well, I'm still analyzing all that data, but what I can say without a doubt already is that if you measure based on heart rate drift, based on perceived exertion drift, meaning that the perceived exertion gets higher as you go, the single 4-hour ride is clearly more stressful than 2 times 2 at the same power. At least from that perspective, you can say, well, they can do the same amount of work, the same, without the same amount of stress. But what we don't know is if we were to somehow be able to go down into the cells and look at the molecular signals for mitochondrial adaptation, it may well be that there is an added benefit to having done that 3rd and 4th hour when you're already glycogen depleted, in the single ride scenario. So there's some interesting stuff going on there, but I do think that in this kind of COVID-19 situation, or if your job demands really make it tough to do the single really long rides, that you get a lot of the adaptive benefit by splitting it up and still adding up to the 4 hours, particularly if you're not racing 4 hours.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
The pros race for 6 hours, so they need to be on the bike 6 hours during training pretty often, because that's their bread and butter.
Yeah.
But for a lot of athletes that aren't on the bike 6 hours, it may make good sense to break things up, and connect it to commutes or whatever. So these are some things that we're exploring, and this digital age is actually making it possible to explore some of these things with fairly good control, laboratory-ish control, without being in a laboratory. So that's one of the things that's happening in this digital world, where we have all these smart bikes and GPS and, heart rate monitors that are connected that I can download files from. So it's opening up for some new ways to look at the training process.
Making lemonade from lemons, a wise man once said.
Yeah, well, long before me. So if the world gives you lemons, then you got to make lemonade. So that, and that's true for researchers. It's true for students. It's true for athletes. We're all making a hell of a lot of lemonade right now.
You're listening to the one and only Dr. Stephen Seiler, sharing around COVID training considerations, pacing for the marathon, and optimizing endurance training. Support for today's show comes from POGO Physio's online physiotherapy consultations. If you are an endurance athlete suffering from a bone, tendon, or joint-related injury, then irrespective of geography, we can assist you in getting back to your physical best through our 45-minute online consultations. Join endurance athletes worldwide who have been getting back to their best through this medium. There is very little that cannot be achieved digitally when it comes to delivering sports physiotherapy online. If you would like to find out more about POGO Physio's online physiotherapy consultations with myself or any of the POGO Physio team, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Stephen Seiler on this, an expert edition around all things COVID training considerations, marathon pacing, and optimizing your endurance training. You know, you mentioned the power of leveraging some of the data available to you through digital platforms. And in one of your recent YouTube videos, which I'd encourage everyone tuning in to make sure you jump over, subscribe to Dr. Seiler's channel. I crammed these in over the last 48 hours in preparation for today, but one that really jumped out, and I think it's worthy of exploring here, given how many runners and triathletes do follow the physical performance show, Stephen, is the one on marathon pacing and hitting the wall. And really it was to explore three key questions. What pace should I aim for? What does hitting the wall mean? And does everybody hit the wall in a marathon? So it was quite a fun and neat little video. I guess the magic question is, what pace should I aim for if I'm going to tackle a marathon?
The pace that it looks like we aim for ends up being right around what we in physiology terms call the first lactate turn point. It's that first, when we bring people into the laboratory and have them run at progressively faster paces, we do 5 minutes at one pace. At the last minute, we measure blood lactate and perceived exertion and so forth. Then they go to another pace. It's a higher. Well, when we do that, we typically identify 2 break points in blood lactate. So the very clear low intensity running, if they're well trained, they may be at 1 millimolar lactate running at 10 kilometers an hour and still exactly at 11 kilometers an hour, and no change in lactate at 12 kilometers an hour. But then at 13, they go from 1 to 1.5 millimolar. That's a small increase in blood lactate concentration, but it's significant, it's meaningful. And then they can restabilize and kind of hover at 2 at a speed of 13 kilometers an hour. But then if they go to 14 and a half, now it breaks some more, and now they're at 5 millimolar. Well, that's that second turn point. Okay? Well, that first turn point where the blood lactate kind of goes up, where you kind of go from this I can do all day to, well, this feels good, but I'm at 85, 83, 84% of max heart rate. I'm working, but this feels good. Well, that typically is marathon pace. And a well-trained runner will be able to hold that for a long time. But what we see with this hitting the wall study, where we had people sent me their race files from flat marathons like Valencia or Berlin, because that gives us better control, on the speed, the pace, heart rate relationship. Well, what I was interested in was this internal workload versus external workload relationship. So you start out the race, you know how it is, you're full of adrenaline, you're feeling good, you're running, and when we measure heart rate, it's typically around 85% of max, but it's stable. And they're running, we don't know their blood lactate, but we do know their speed is stable and their heart rate is stable. And so these two lines, heart rate and speed, are kind of in parallel with each other. And so that's kind of phase one of a marathon for the athlete that's well prepared and they've found the right pace. And then phase two of the marathon is usually it happens around 60% of the way in, maybe as early as 50% of the way in, maybe as late as 70. We start to see that heart rate is getting higher, even though speed is staying the same. They're still hanging on to the pace. They're feeling okay, but corresponding to that, it's feeling tougher. They're starting to having to dig into their mental reserves to hold pace, but they're doing it. Well, that's phase 2, where you're getting this internal workload shift. It's costing your body more to hold that speed, but you're able to do it. And then phase 3, well, that is the proverbial wall. And that is that for at least a lot of marathon runners, even though they've got the pace right, they've had, been really stable for 80% of the race, in that last 20%, just to throw out a number, now not only is heart rate going up, but they just can't hold pace. They start to slide down. Their pace goes down, heart rate still goes up. Now the body is basically breaking down. It's just saying, this is more than I can do. Now, why is that happening? Well, glycogen depletion is probably part of the issue. Micro damage to musculature is part of the issue, because marathons are run on asphalt and the legs are getting pounded. So there's different reasons why this is happening. The body's having to recruit more muscles to do the same job, and eventually you kind of literally physiologically hit the wall. So, the marathon is not a steady state situation. Even though you're running at a steady pace, it is a war of attrition. It's a physiological attrition war. And the best prepared athletes, over time, they are able to delay, keep pushing that attrition farther and farther towards the finish of the race, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are some that their pace doesn't decline. They are able to hold a flat pace. So the answer to the question, does everybody hit the wall? Well, from that perspective, no. There are athletes, we know some of the best in the world, they don't. They stay at a flat, a consistent speed all the way to the goal line or the finish line.
Without that deterioration. So he or she that can fade or deteriorate the least is normally the victor, right? But as you say, there are those that can maintain that pace where mere mortals, the majority of us, will start to decouple and the internal work's going up, but sadly the pace is going backwards.
Yeah, and it's happening even for the best in the world. They are deteriorating, but they are so fit and they're able to manage it, and they've got this reserve that, despite the fact that, they are working really hard, they're able to hold pace. So I think that should be at least some solace to all of us that, like, even I remember Greg LeMond, there was a famous quote. He was a cyclist, Tour de France winner. He says, look, it never gets easier. You just go faster. So with the great runners, they are also, Kipchoge is feeling the pain at the end of a race, but he's so well trained that he's able to hold the pace. So I don't think we should have this false idea that these great athletes, that it's easy for them or they don't feel the same pain. They do, but they are supremely well trained and also genetically gifted and also masters of pacing.
And on the pacing side and just on the substrate utilization, the fueling, Trent Stellingworth, former guest of the show, mentioned that even the elites, of course, everyone will be glycogen depleted at the finish line.
Absolutely. And that's what's this bizarre aspect of it is this hitting the wall process seems to happen, or that template that I described to you looks pretty similar, whether you're a 2:12 marathoner or a 3:20 marathoner. It kind of happens at the same time, relative time point in the race. So when I said, that they tend to be pretty stable for the first 60%, well, that was true for the 3 hour and the 2:12 guy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But they're burning glycogen probably at different rates, and they're at different percentages of their maximum capacity. So there's some interesting kind of ways. So nowadays, we even design some tools for analyzing this stuff, where we just can look at percent of total race time. So we equilibrated everybody to what was happening to you at a given percentage of your total race time.
So you mean physiologically, what was happening at 25% of your race time?
Right. So if you ran 3 hours or 2:45 or 2:20 or 2:30, it was all calibrated to
percentage,
100% of race time. Right.
Yeah.
And so what was happening, and that way of analyzing it was interesting because it kind of said, well, you know, for the 2 hour 2:10 person, it's still happening at about the same time in the race for them as it is for the 3 hour rider or runner. Now, I don't know how far you can take this. If you talk about someone who's really running slow and maybe they're doing a marathon in, I don't know, 4.5 hours, then that may well change just because you really change some of the fatigue issues at such a long duration. But I think in that window 2 to 3 hours, that template basically looks the same.
You know, there's a lot of data analysis, and I know you credited one of your colleagues, John Peters, for some of the great work. You had 500, performances that you both collectively looked at from these flat marathons, as you say. But one of the interesting findings was the table that you published around 5 kilometre pace being about 4% faster than 10 kilometre pace. Can you just share a little on some of those pacing findings?
Well, yeah, what we did there, I was thinking, what was he referring to? But now I remember, yeah, we went into the IAAF data, the top 500. So we said, let's go in and find the top 500 performers in the 5K, the 10K, the half marathon, and the marathon. And then we identified a subset of runners that were at that level of performance, but that had also they'd raced those 4 distances in the same season. Does that make sense? So they had raced a 5,000, a 10,000, a half marathon, and a marathon in the same track season or running season. And that was a subset I think for the women, it was about 70 performances, 75. And for the men, it was about 40 performances that we were able to identify. And then we could say, all right, what percentage? Now we're talking about the same athlete. It's not cross-sectional. It's the same athlete running a 5K, a 10K, a half marathon, and a marathon. What percentage of their speed are they holding for these different times? So what we saw was that both for men and for women, the entire range of velocity from 5K speed to marathon speed for this group was 13%. The range in running speed that they are covering, the 5K is only 13% faster. The pace, or if you were to describe it as meters per second that they're running at, that pace they're holding is on average 13% faster than the pace they were able to hold for a marathon. Now, this is interesting because in both cases, it's a 10-fold difference in duration. In other words, the guys, this was like 13 minutes and change for 5K versus 130 minutes on average for a marathon. So over a 10-fold range in race duration, the pace difference was 13%. So it was kind of mathematically a bit elegant in the sense that everything lined up, and it was identical for men and women. Okay, there was zero difference in the different paces. So 10K pace was 3.5% slower, and then 4% more slower was the half marathon, and then the jump from half marathon to marathon was 5%. So there was a little bit different, the doublings were a little bit more costly in the longest distance. The smallest gap was 5K to 10K. That's only about a 3.5% difference in speed for the really well-trained athletes. But when you get out to the jump from a half marathon to a marathon, the pace slows down about 5% on average for them. So is that a big difference, 3%, 3.5 versus 5? Well, it is a difference for world class. It's clearly, it's worthwhile to understand. And it's probably due to the fact that transition from half marathon to marathon, you're hitting this glycogen limitation. So hence the wall. And hence, that whereas you don't have glycogen is not a limiting factor in a 5K or a 10K, and it's not a factor in a half marathon probably. In that transition, from half marathon to marathon, then nutrition status, hydration status, these kinds of body maintenance issues come into play in a way that they do not in those shorter distances.
And if we look at it through the lens, the findings there, Stephen, for a marathoner looking to extrapolate with a known 5 kilometre pace, what kilometre pace or mile pace they should be holding for the marathon, you're then able to calculate it with some sensitivity, correct?
You are. Again, there is variation around that average. So I want to be careful, and this is the elite performers.
Yeah.
I think if you're a first-time marathoner and you've done a lot of 5Ks, you've gotten good, you're a 5K, 10K specialist, and then you're stretching yourself to a marathon, I think it's probably intelligent to be on the conservative side in your pacing strategy over the first half of the race and not say, well, I'm going to just assume that, I'm going to use those world-class numbers because we have to remember those world-class numbers are achieved with a world-class training volume.
Yeah.
So I would be a bit careful. But I think the other thing that I think is important about this is there is not this sudden magic where you say, well, I'm not very good in the 5K. My speed's not very good. But if I go to the marathon, everything's going to be better. I'm going to be a good marathoner. No, you're not. If you, I'm sorry, but if you don't have good 5K, 10K speed, then you're not going to be particularly good in the marathon either. That's one of the other lessons. And that's also a lesson that, like you take the guy, Renato Canova, who's coached all these marathoners. That's what he says, point blank, is he says, look, one of the biggest challenges the great Kenyan runners have is that when they go up to the marathon and they had world-class 5K speed, if they stop doing all of the work that got them there at the 5K level, then their marathon gets worse too, because you still got to be running darn fast if you're going to be running a 2:05 marathon, or if in that world they live in. Well, the point, it's all connected. I guess that's what I want to say is that, and I say this to my daughter as well, because her ultimate goal is to be a marathoner, but it's too early for her to run marathons. Her longest distance is half marathon right now. I say, look, if you're ever going to run a really good marathon, it will be because you also run a very good 5K.
Absolutely.
And so that's the mentality that I want her to have, is that, hey, speed is the key ingredient, even down the road for the marathon. When we get you better at 5K, when better at 3,000 meters, you've got some speed reserve, down the road, that's going to pay off for you as a marathoner in 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, you look on the male side, Kenenisa Bekele and certainly Eliud Kipchoge, and their 5 and 10,000 metre times are certainly not shabby. They're world class. Obviously, Kenenisa is still the world record holder for 10,000 metres.
Yeah. I'm not saying we compare ourselves directly with these world class, but there is some underlying physiology that's also true for age groupers. Don't think that something magical is going to happen and just by stretching the distance, because that's kind of what we do as we get older. We tend to say, well, I don't have that burst of speed anymore. But if I stretch the distance, I'll be better. Yeah, not really. You'll still be kind of, relatively speaking, where you were before. So don't abandon the need for speed as you go to the longer distances, because speed reserve is still good technique. Smooth, easy speed also translates to better half marathons and marathons.
You're listening to Dr. Stephen Seiler on this, an expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. If you missed last week's episode, it was another expert edition where I caught up with acclaimed endurance sports author of over 17 titles and co-founder of Training Peaks, Joe Friel. Joe has been described as the coach of coaches, and he's shared from his 40 years of accrued coaching wisdom. Here's a little snippet of what you missed.
The first thing you discover about the masters athletes is they need more frequent recovery days. They don't recover as quickly as they did when they were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. By the time you're in your 50s, you begin to notice that it's just taking a little bit longer to recover between hard workouts. I can recall when I was in college running on the track team, our coach only knew one workout. It was the same workout every day. It was what I called intervals till you puke. And so consequently, we'd just go out there and we'd run intervals till we puke every day. And so I began to learn at an early age that that was not a good way to train. So that led me this whole thing of asking questions about what's the better way of doing this.
To glean from the many learnings that Joe shared, be sure to jump over and enjoy the full episode from wherever podcasts are found. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition guest, Dr. Stephen Seiler, acclaimed sports scientist and forefather of the polarized training approach. Episode 172, you shared that the training principles, the polarized training method, as you've coined it so eloquently over the years, the findings can be tapered down to the recreational weekend warrior, and in this case, that applies largely as well.
It does, and I, like I always say, it's important for other people to interrogate this data and continuously challenge the assumptions. But what we have seen in both in controlled studies, but also just lots of feedback over the years now, is that yes, when recreational age groupers training 6 hours a week, when they get control of their intensity distribution, when they quit chasing squirrels, they just, as they report back so often, say, you know what, this works. I run slower on some of the days than I ever have before, but I'm also running faster on some of the days than I ever have before, and I've set new PRs. That is a very typical thing. So I don't want people to think that what I'm saying is just go slow all the time and you'll go fast on race day. That's not what I'm saying, and that's not polarized training. What we're saying is manage your training, manage your stress, do the low intensity, stay below the stress radar, build mitochondria, and then have the energy to do those tough tempo and high intensity sessions, and put it all together on race day, and you're going to be rested and ready, and you're also going to have you're going to find that you do have the physiology to compete very well. And that's what we see.
Yeah. So it goes back to kind of one of your points for COVID. Keep the basics. Make sure they don't get skipped. That's right. And there was another guy that I know, he talks about this, and Trevor Connor was talking about he and I both love physiology, and physiology is amazingly complicated and complex. I mean, man, there's so many fancy redundancies and pathways and metabolics and blah, 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 blah. And nerds like me, we can really just go to town looking at all these details. But the training process that you use to adapt and to turn on all this physiology is not complicated. And that's what we really have to understand. We have a tendency to think that if I develop this super structured, complicated interval session, with undulating power output and differences in the rest recovery and blah, 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 that's going to somehow be the magic. Well, give me a break. It's not. When we go in and look at the training of really good athletes, great Kenyan runners, great rowers, great cyclists, you see that it is pretty darn simple. Mm-hmm. They're doing the work.
they're getting out there every day. They're finding a sustainable process. They're staying healthy. That's important. Their success at the elite level is almost always associated with an extended period of time where they stay pretty much injury-free and healthy. And how do they do that? They find a sustainable low workload. They push themselves, yes, but they don't push themselves over the cliff. And that is a lesson that also applies to the weekend or the age grouper that has a very different set of stressors that they deal with. So this total stress load of the age grouper that's got a full-time job, 2 kids, a mortgage, you know what I'm saying, versus the elite athlete that all they do is wake up, train, eat, take a nap, eat, train again, race, Well, both of them in terms of total stress are about the same. It's just that the elite athlete, they pour all of their stress budget into one thing. Whereas most of us don't have that luxury or don't have that desire. And
it always seems to lead back to Shona Halson, AIS, former AIS, Australian Institute of Sport scientist, recovery scientist, who I think so eloquently sums it up. The only training an athlete is benefiting from is the training that they are recovering from, which feeds directly into your work.
So that's what it comes down to. You got to be able to absorb it, absorb the training to benefit from it. And that's a hard lesson because the clientele that you aspire to, you work with, the people that listen to me are, as a rule, very goal-oriented, very systematic, very willing. Like I always say, my daughter, she carries a big shovel when she goes to a workout, and she's ready to dig deep. So that is the mindset. It's a wonderful mindset. I love working with people like that. But we have to understand the dark side of that mindset. And that mindset, it's like it's a hammer. And it is great at hammering nails. When you need to go hard and your body hurts and you're at the 4th interval of a 4 times 8, man, it's fantastic to have an athlete with that mindset, because I know they're going to dig deep. They're going to do what's necessary. But the problem is they're also going to dig deep when I want them to chill out. They're going to have a tendency to go too hard when they should be giving their body time to absorb the training. So with every talent usually comes a dark side. Every gift comes a certain degree of a curse that has to be managed. I think that's one of the things we see with talent, is that the talent, the extreme abilities that people have do often come with some kind of a liability. There's ability and liability, and we have to be cognizant of that dyad, that two-sidedness of these qualities.
The blessing and the burden. Johnny Brownlee recently featured a performer on the show, Stephen. He mentioned that one of his bone stress or bone injury tips that he learned over the years was the need to sit down, to not clean his bike and to not tidy up his socks. As he said, he just realised he had to sit down. And when he got back to sitting down between some sessions, it's one of his top 3, tips on managing / preventing bone stress injuries in triathletes or in runners.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, because I used to work, I remember when I worked with speed skaters from Holland, and then I would join them at camps, and they are amazing in their ability to turn things on and off. Because they would be training twice, even sometimes 3 times in a day. But man, when they weren't training, they were in bed. They were laying down. They went another step beyond the sit down. They believed in lying down between workouts. So that that's part of it, is having that ability to turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off, and not spin. A lot of athletes have a tendency to spin. They can't get out of their own head, either both physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
I guess I have a feeling there is a bit of a gender difference there. I'm going to be very careful because I know there's overlapping in all of this stuff, but my daughter is that classic, typical, clever girl. We say in Norwegian, they call it flink pike, which means they are always going to be good at whatever they do. They're going to get the A's in class. They're going to set a PR in training. They're going to, and they just don't give themselves a break. Whereas the guys tend to have a little bit of an easier time of turning it on and off, if you know what I'm saying. They have their weaknesses. Because they're not. It's harder to get them to be structured. They're the ones that chase squirrels. So there are abilities and liabilities associated with these different kinds of mindsets that athletes bring to the table. And then we're back to coaching, and it's really useful to kind of know your athlete.
So much there, the art and the science. Dr. Stephen Seiler, you will be going live on a live stream in several weeks' time around sustainable training for attainable endurance goals. So I believe you've been working behind the scenes to condense 8 to 9 to 10 hours of face-to-face workshopping, which would have been the case pre-COVID, into consolidated essentials. So that process must be challenging, but refining the content as you go.
Well, I'm procrastinating on some of that because, I'm putting it off, but because I'm working on a lot of stuff at the same time. But it's in the back of my head is what are the, like you challenged me, asking me to say 3 things about the COVID. And so that's what I'm challenging myself to do, is say, what are the most valuable takeaways from 20 years of research related to these different big themes that we're going to go through. We're going to talk about training intensity distribution as a big theme. We're going to talk about interval training, prescription, and execution as a big theme. We're going to talk about, now I got to remember what else we're going to talk. We're going to talk about periodization and planning of the season as a big theme. And then the 4th theme we're going to talk about is monitoring of training, the training monitoring process. What are the variables we need to be looking at? And spoiler alert, I'm basically going to say there is a holy trinity of variables that we need to use in concert with each other. 3 different kinds of information that we need to we should basically always use in a complementary fashion. So those are going to be the big themes, and you're giving me some constraints on time, and that gives me a drive to try to whittle this down to the essentials.
Constraints are the breeding ground for creativity and refinement, right?
That's right. So, we're all dealing with some interesting constraints right now. So, yeah, that's good. I was just going to say I would have been down under with you in July, but now we're going to do this digitally, and I think it's again lemonade out of lemons, because it is forcing us to do something differently, but it also makes it possible for people to tune in from wherever they are in the world, and not just from perhaps just Gold Coast, Australia.
Yeah, and there were certainly people travelling from within Australia across the borders for July's in-person to-be event. But as you say now, there's, these digital platforms open up for worldwide concurrent interactions, which is just phenomenal and exciting. Dr. Stephen Seiler, you are, a treasure to the world of sports sciences. Thank you for your contribution to this show, and we look forwards to the live stream in several weeks.
Thank you. And everybody just keep training, stay safe.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed today's episode. If you know someone in your world who would benefit from the learnings of Dr. Stephen Seiler, the wisdom shared today, then please extend this episode to them. A massive thanks to those, as always, leaving ratings and reviews in iTunes and also hitting subscribe to the show. If you've been enjoying more than 4 episodes, then it's time to hit subscribe and be sure to get the show into your feed each and every Thursday as the episodes go live. Now, if you are yet to register for the upcoming Dr. Stephen Seiler 3-hour live stream event, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals, where, as you heard, Dr. Seiler will condense 20 years of the science into a 3-hour live masterclass, then be sure to jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler and secure your place. Tickets are just $49 Australian, and that gives you access real time to one of the planet's best and brightest minds around all things endurance training. I am eager myself to find out about this holy trinity that Dr. Seiler referenced, and of course explore the key 4 modules: intensity distribution, interval training, periodization, and monitoring. There will be a post live stream recording that goes to every paid registrant, along with a workbook that will also be provided. It's incredible value for just $49, and be sure to secure your place today. If you know friends, training buddies who would also benefit and enjoy such an event, then please go ahead and share with your buddies. If you're on social media, the link is easily also found over on our Instagram account at Physical Performance Show. Now, talking about at Physical Performance Show, please keep the podsies coming over on social. They are a whole lot of fun. At Physical Performance Show, at Brad_Beer. We love seeing those come through. That's a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying and simply tagging in the show. Don't forget, there is a Facebook group for the Physical Performance Show. You'll find that online easily, and we'd love to see you in the group. A massive thanks to the 3 good folk who make this show possible each and every week: Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design. Now, coming up on the Physical Performance Show, we have some real treats for you. Next week, we pushed it out 1 week to bring you Dr. Stephen Seiler this week, but next week we'll feature Australian swimming superstar Michael Klim on a featured performer episode, sharing Michael's career highs, lows, and many learnings. Following Michael's sharings, we throw to Abdi Abdirahman, the 45-year-old American distance running sensation who in February at the Atlanta US Marathon Trials qualified for his 5th US Olympic Marathon team, making Abdi the oldest US Olympic athlete to date. And following the massive amount of feedback that came through from Professor Peter Rayburn's Masters Athlete Expert Edition, we figured that sharing with you more insights into great level Masters athletes would be appreciated. So be sure to be tuning in over the next 2 weeks to the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.